Beth,
Yes, sir.
you hear me okay?
I can.
Okay. All right, good afternoon to everyone. Looks like we've got everyone here. Ms. Scott just said she was on a call and will be joining us shortly. It looks like other than that, we have folks here. So again, good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to our work session for today. I'm going to, as we get started, we've got a pretty packed agenda, even though it's just 2 items, very meaty items, and then a lot to do in our board meeting as well, of course, as we're waiting what the governor has to say as well with regard to opening schools, reopening our schools. So what I'm going to do is to switch the 2 items on our agenda and start with the overview and discussion of the SRO program first. And by that time, there may be some announcement that will help inform our discussion on the update and reopening plans for schools. So with the overview and discussion of the SRO program, that is Dr. Lord Gardner and Russ Smith. So I will kick it over to the 2 of you. Good afternoon to you both.
Good afternoon, Board Chair Sutton. Thank you. And good afternoon, Superintendent Moore and members of the board. Thank you for this opportunity to provide an overview of our SRO program. This really will be a first of a series of discussions scheduled to review the SRO program. As setting the stage, the presentation today was designed intentionally to provide a high-level overview of the SRO program, with an opportunity to share with you a revised timeline to support the discussions and the processes for seeking input from our stakeholders, both in our schools and in our community. Please know that moving forward with discussions scheduled at the work sessions, there will be a deeper dive into many more data points and components of the program, including such data points as referrals, funding, among other factors that certainly no doubt will be important for your discussions as you examine the program and any potential future MOU agreements. At this time, I invite Russ Smith, Senior Director of Security, to facilitate the presentation. And again, thank you, members of the board, for this opportunity. Mr. Smith?
Thank you, Dr. Gardner. Chair Sutton, board members, and Superintendent Moore, I'm very happy to be here today to provide an overview of the School Resource Officer Program for the Wake County Public School System. School Resource Officers, or SROs, were placed in all Wake County high schools in April of 1993, with the Wake County Sheriff's Office being the agency that provided them. By 1996, the local municipalities took over the responsibilities of providing high school SROs that were located within their jurisdiction. In 2001, the SROs were placed in middle schools. It was a partnership between local municipalities, the Wake County Sheriff's Office, and Wake County Schools that was based on a federal grant. While the program has been in place for approximately 27 years, the first MOU was not put into place until 2009. That first one covered a 5-year period, 2009 to 2014. We updated the MOU, the second one that covered 2014 to 2017. Then the third one was updated and covered 2017 to 2020. So what does the program look like within the district? Generally, there's a middle and a high school SRO full-time assigned to each school. The towns of Holly Springs and Apex have elementary SROs that cover multiple campuses. But collectively, there's approximately 75 SROs that cover 75 schools. There's been some questions in the past in reference to funding, and I'd like to give a high-level view of the funding for the SROs. As mentioned previously, there's 75 SROs in our schools. Of those 75 officers, 39 of them are 100% funded by the local municipalities, meaning zero Wake County Public School System dollars. The rest of the officers are partially funded by Wake County schools through state and local funding. So for the 2019-2020 school year, Wake County Public School System spent state funding of just over $1,021,000. Wake County Public School System also spent local funding just over $112,000 for the total funds spent just over $1,134,000, which actually represents a very small cost of the overall cost for all the municipalities. If you were to average out the total Wake County Public School System cost over those 75 officers, the average is just over about $15,000 per SRO. However, as we noted before, there's 75 officers that are funded by municipalities. And when you spread that average out over the 75, that's what is reflected here. For the state funding that was provided towards the high school SROs, we actually spend about $37,838 per one high school SRO in a school. We understand also that there may be some interest in the total costs of the local municipalities. I don't have that today, but I'll be able to provide that to you in the future. As a part of the MOU, the district collects data from law enforcement agencies, and so we wanted to provide you with just a little bit of data. I know that that has been requested before in the past, and we certainly want to provide that to you moving forward. These numbers here on this slide represent all the SRO interactions that have been referred to the adult court system, the juvenile court system, and all other diversion programs to include teen court and others. We have included a very high level, again, this is very high level district data covering those 4 years. And this represents the last three or the 3 years of the previous MOU, as well as the 1 year prior to the last 3-year agreement. You'll notice that for the first year of the 2017 to 2020 time period, there was an approximate 41% decrease of SRO referrals. The following year, you'll see an approximate 10% increase for that second year. And then for the third year, you'll see an approximate 13% decrease. But we need to note that it only covers about 3/4 of the school year due to the abrupt closure of schools this past year. Also of note, while the racial disparities show some decrease over the course of time, we will need to continue to examine and unpack information related to gender and race. Moving forward to the vision and goal of the SRO program, the vision and goal of the program is to provide a safe and secure learning environment with the ultimate goal to provide a safe, inclusive, and positive learning environment for all students, staff, and other members of the community. So that essentially is our high-level overview of just the program itself. Now I would like to transition into a recap of where we are today and where with a timeline moving forward. As you recall, the board approved a year agreement in June of 2020 to govern the program for the 2020-2021 school year. The board has indicated its interest to engage in a robust dialogue with stakeholders to contemplate further revisions to any next SRO MOU that would govern the program beyond next year. A timeline for the 2021-2024 agreement was proposed as a part of the approval of the 2020-2021 MOU. At the request of board members, the timeline has been revised, will be presented here in a few minutes, and includes specific proposals for collecting and reviewing stakeholder feedback. I want to kind of go over the initial proposed timeline to show where the changes are. The initial proposed timeline was provided to the board in April 2020 and was included in the presentation to the board in June 2020 for the current one-year agreement that we have in place. We were to solicit feedback on the current MOU from public and law enforcement by November 1st of 2020. We were then going to obtain feedback from the board throughout and also no later than December 1st of 2020. We were then going to process, review, and assess the feedback by January 1st of 2021. We were then going to provide a revised SRO MOU for review by district leadership and the board by February 1st of 2021. We were then going to issue a revised SRO MOU for review by law enforcement and to obtain final public feedback by March 21st, 2021, with a goal to try to finalize the revisions and seek board approval of the revised SRO MOU by May 1st of 2021. So as I mentioned earlier, based upon feedback from the board, we're proposing this new timeline. We would like to solicit stakeholder feedback on the current SRO MOU via survey accessible from August the 1st to September the 1st of 2020. The purpose is to obtain baseline data that will help shape focus groups moving forward. We would provide board members with referral data on the SRO program as previously requested, no later than August the 18th of 2020. This would be a much deeper dive into the data referenced earlier in the presentation. At that time, we would start to review, analyze, and mine survey feedback to identify key themes, topics, and questions for discussion in focus groups. We would then convene and facilitate those focus groups to solicit the further feedback and try to have that completed by November 1st of 2020. We would then move on to provide status update to the board and a snapshot of feedback from survey and focus groups by December 15th of 2020. We would convene at least one board work session by February the 16th, 2021 to further unpack and analyze data from the survey and focus groups and identify areas of the MOU in need of revision. Also, and it's very important, at this point, the following question would need to be answered. Does the Wake County Public School System believe that we should continue the SRO program? Depending upon the direction set forth by the board, we would then provide a draft of SRO MOU revisions to the board for review by March the 1st of 2021. Then we would propose issuing a revised SRO MOU to law enforcement agencies and to stakeholders for final feedback by April 1st of 2021. Consult with the board on additional feedback from stakeholders by May 1st of 2021. And then finalize the revisions and seek board approval of revised SRO MOU by May the 18th of 2021. I'd like to point out that some of the key points to the new proposed timeline. First, per this new timeline, we're moving up the deadline for obtaining feedback from stakeholders through the one tool, the survey, by 2 months. This specifically addresses the board's request for changes to the timeline to capitalize on current requests from members of the school community to provide valuable input regarding the current SRO MOU. By obtaining the general feedback via the survey, staff will have the opportunity to thoroughly review that feedback to identify key issues and areas for further dialogue that we think are best suited to focus groups. There's a 2-month space between the deadline for collecting survey feedback and the deadline for convening focus groups, and this was done intentionally. We want to ensure that we have ample time to schedule and convene focus group meetings to hear from a diverse array of perspectives. Further, this 2-month time frame will allow staff an opportunity to use the data retrieved through the survey to tailor focus group discussions to obtain additional information about the issues that emerge as key issues from the survey feedback. So we also wanted to take a little bit of a deeper dive into the proposed process for the community feedback on the program. As mentioned earlier, we're going to utilize a dual phase that provides stakeholders with an opportunity to provide feedback that will inform subsequent phases of the review process. 2 phases. Phase 1 would be a survey offered online and made available to identified stakeholders to be completed by September 1, 2020. Phase 2, to conduct multiple virtual focus groups to gather feedback to be completed by November 1, 2020. We are proposing that phase 1 survey be open for 30 days. The survey link will be accessible to the following groups. Of course, Wake County Public School System parents and guardians, Wake County Public School System students, Wake County Public School System principals, as well as community groups, various community groups that have shown interest in providing feedback on the SRO program. For example, our CELT group, legal aid, and there may be others that we want to identify to make sure that we have an opportunity to provide a feedback on the program. Survey data will then be reviewed by district staff to identify groups for further dialogue among focus groups. Phase 2 will consist of those focus groups. We are proposing that district staff will convene focus groups with the following stakeholders: Wake County Public School System school-based staff to include administrators and teachers, Wake County Public School System parents and guardians, Wake County Public School System students, community groups, as well as law enforcement representatives from all agencies. At this point, I'd like to I know I've been going kind of fast. I just want to stop and see if at this point, and ask the board if they have any thoughts or feedback on the proposed process and the timeline for the surveys.
Thank you, Russ. I want to make just a couple of comments quickly before getting into questions, both for the benefit of the board and any of those that are tuning in to our discussion. This does not assume that we will have an SRO program or maintain the SRO program in its current form. I think Russ kind of touched on that, but I just want to make sure that that was highlighted, that this does not assume we will continue the SRO program as it currently stands. And the second thing is that we do have on the agenda a proposal for a safety and security task force. And so some of the work flow or processes that Russ mentioned may change slightly upon the adoption of the Safety and Security Committee, which is on our action agenda for today. So I'll go to questions now and open it up. I'll start with Ms. Kushner. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Chair Sutton and colleagues. It's good to see you all, and thank you for that presentation, Mr. Smith. I appreciate the revised timeline. I think you've listened to board feedback, and I just wanted to raise a couple issues. One is if you considered the role of our board advisory councils either as a formalized focus group or as an informal way of getting some community feedback as part of the timeline. And I also was wondering if the role of the contractors that we have that serve as security staff contractors are also going to be part of this evaluation of security and safety, the folks in the yellow jackets.
So a couple of great points. So yes, the board advisory councils can certainly be a part of this gathering of information. That was one of the areas that we thought of that potentially, if board members so choose, we can certainly utilize that as a focus group area to facilitate those as well. And then secondly, I don't think a lot of thought was put into the security officers, since they're not sworn law enforcement and not a part of the SRO program, but they certainly can be if that's the direction you would so choose for us to go.
Well, I think it's important if we're addressing school climate that we look at it holistically, because that staff can also have policing duties, with not being a formal law enforcement, but they certainly can also give rise to some of the concerns we've heard from students about an unwelcoming school climate. So I think we need to make sure that we're looking as broadly as we can at making our schools welcoming to students and de-escalating criminalization of behavior that shouldn't be escalated to a criminal or a referral level. And I was struck by the decline in teen court. I've had suggestions from some students to have more expanded use of teen court and peer review, even on a school by school basis. So I hope that's something that we can integrate into the task force, Mr. Sutton, if you think that's, we can brainstorm alternatives and additional ways of making sure we de-escalate and address behaviors in a way that still is inclusive and supportive in the school community.
Thank you, Ms. Kushner. Ms. Mahaffey, I saw your hand next. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Chair Sutton. Good afternoon, Dr. Gardner and Mr. Smith. Thank you for bringing this. I appreciate, Mr. Smith, you articulating the deep dive and what the difference between phase 1 and phase 2 are going to be as we solicit community feedback. I'm hoping for phase 1 we can add teachers to that survey. I noticed they're on the phase 2 focus group, but I know that they have a unique perspective of the role of school resource officers as well. On page 6, where we're seeing the referrals over time, I'm hopeful that we can get a little more delineation eventually by age or grade, whether that student had an IEP or a behavior intervention plan. And then a little more of what other diversion means as we go forward in this conversation. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mahaffey. Mr. Hegarty, I think I saw your hand next. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Sutton. Thank you, Mr. Smith. I really appreciate the presentation, and I appreciate all the work that went into this timeline. And I think you heard from us the priority it was that we have a real community conversation on this and really get a good discussion around these issues. I have a question about the timeline, but it's not a question about the surveys. If I could, I'd like you to go back a few pages. I believe it is page 12 on your timeline. One of the things that I'm worried about is getting put in a position where maybe we all decide that there are changes that are needed in the program. And we take all of this feedback, we have a revised MOU to share, we've shared it with stakeholders, and then we give it to law enforcement agencies, and they say no. With this timeline, if we get to this stake, or we get to this deadline, seek board approval of revised SRO MOU by May 18th, 2020. What happens, or how much time do we have if law enforcement doesn't agree to the changes that we'd like to make?
That's a great question, Mr. Haggerty. So we didn't wait until we typically have utilized in the past. We actually have moved it up into May. So you've got about 6 weeks. Talking about maybe a month of time. It doesn't sound like a whole lot, and I certainly understand that. If there's, again, we would want to seek consensus, and if we can't get the consensus, we wouldn't be able to move forward with an agreement unless we had agreed to just to kind of split it off. And that, I think that's been some discussion in the past, and I don't think we want to do that. We want to keep it consistent across the district. So, I think, what we'll try to do is we continue to, we've still got until the end of June to correct it. And that would be our timeline. We would just have to use our due diligence to do that before the end of June.
Okay. I appreciate that. And I guess that'll just be one of the things that we look at as we go forward in the process. Is there any sort of contingency plan or fallback plan that we might need if we can't work out an agreement? I'm hopeful that we could, and I don't want to, be pessimistic about any negotiations or anything. I just want to make sure that we've got all bases covered.
Well, and that once we come down that particular path, we'll certainly keep that in mind and certainly think about having to have a plan in place in the event that we can't come to an agreement.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for your work on this.
And if I could just respond to that also, Mr. Hagerty. And as I mentioned earlier, this does not assume that, that we will have an SRO program. So I want to make sure that we leave some space for new thinking, if you will. Because I think an MOU, a memorandum of understanding, assumes that there is a partnership relationship between two entities, and we're drafting a agreement to work together. But I think it's really up to the board, staff, and all the community feedback and input that we get. And we may, for example, articulate a new vision for how we keep our schools and environments, our school communities safe. That may or may not involve law enforcement. And so I think we have to at least think about this going in as a, do we want something like an MOU that again assumes that there is a relationship, or is this more of a, when we issue a request for proposals or bids, and as we articulate a vision for a program, that we may put this out to law enforcement agencies or other potential organizations that may be able to do something similar. And then it's up to them if they can meet what we articulate or describe as a vision. So I just want to sort of, again, make sure that we're leaving this open to all options and new thinking. Nothing is off the table. Again, we may continue with something that continues a partnership with law enforcement, or it could involve a eventual phasing in or phasing out, and phasing in of some new programs as well. So again, I just want to encourage us to leave open our thinking and room for new thinking.
Mr. Sutton, I want to thank you for that. And I just, want to emphasize that in my questions, I wasn't trying to prejudge that we would arrive at that decision. I think your points are very, very important. I appreciate that clarification.
Yes, sir. Dr. Martin, I think I saw you. Mr. Hagerty, were you through or finished?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, sir. Dr. Martin, I think I saw your hand next.
Thank you. And I do appreciate this last line of discussion. And I do think, Mr. Sutton, to your point, that a lot of this work will be done in the Standing Safety and Security Committee, which we know that a lot of the heavy lifting has to be done in committee. But partly related to the survey, partly the committee work and partly related to the survey, I think it would be important to not just survey the current program, strengths and weaknesses, whatever, but I think it's important for us to ask, what is it that we're trying to do? And then once we ask that question, then we can ask, what is the most effective way to do what we're trying to do? And that's where we do need to keep that sort of objective mind. Is it an SRO program? Is it something else? I mean, to say that there will not be interactions with law enforcement, that we live in a society where law enforcement is part of what we interact with. So we've got to find a way to do that interaction. But will it be an SRO program or something like else? I don't think we know until we look at it objectively. But throughout the survey process, I'd like a component of it to really have us fundamentally ask, what is it that we want to do, and then how best to accomplish that. I know that in part after having a conversation with a retired sheriff who we had a very good conversation on this, and he reminded me, that Sheriff Baker put the SRO program in place with much more of a counselor mentality when it started. But as this gentleman recognized, it was really post 9/11 that everything shifted to much more of a punishment and arrest mentality. So I think in our process, it would also be good to look at some of the history of the program. So that's kind of a comment and a point, just hoping that we can get sort of what is it we want to do as part of the survey. The question that I have is, what is the preferred mechanism for the board to offer, these are pieces of information that we really need? I see in your timeline, and I appreciate the updated timeline, but you're looking at providing board members with data no later than August 18th. That's a month away. Knowing the time that it takes to sort of generate things, I'm wondering what has been thought about, kind of like what we do with our budget meetings and whatnot. Do you have ideas of a mechanism for the board to say, hey, these are points of information where we would like additional data? And related to that, I believe it's important that the board have access to some confidential levels of data. Some of the data, could become pretty close to personnel records because of staff involvement, school involvement, and so on. And just like our school safety committees, that information is not public record. At the same time, I think it's critical for the board to be able to review some of this information that is likely to be more confidential. So what's the process to get, here's the questions that we need data about, and what's the process to make sure the board will be able to review even data that has privacy issues that we need to be more careful about?
Dr. Martin, who was that question for Mrs. Smith? I'm not.
That could be for
that might be
Mr.
more of a
Smith,
Kathy
could be for
question.
Dr. Gardner, could be for Superintendent Moore. I mean, I think
Yeah.
it's a process-related question, and it may even be partly a Mr. Bloomberg question, because access to all of the information at the level of detail that I feel like we need as a board to review would sort of be like laying out safety plans from a school, which we can't do. That would create more of a security risk, and yet we have to be able to review those. So I think there's multiple levels to the question.
I was going to say, I think that we may need to create a list, sort of a chart of what we're looking at, what'll be disaggregated, what'll be in different formats for board review to see, and then determine the setting in which it's best to review it.
And from a legal perspective,
oh, go ahead, Jonathan.
I'm sorry. And from a legal perspective, there's not a problem with the board having access to any and all information, however confidential. It's just what setting would be in, as Kathy said. If it's confidential, then that would be closed session to protect it. But the board certainly is entitled to, and there's no legal barrier to the board seeing any and all information, however confidential.
So I appreciate that. Like I say, I think it's important that gets worked into the process as we go forward.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. Ms. Johnson-Hosler, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much. I certainly agree, Mr. Sutton, the last comments you made prior to Dr. Barton and letting us know kind of your thoughts about the opportunity and purpose of the ad hoc committee. And while I'm certainly glad we're going to have it. I still have quite a few questions, but before I start the questions, I do want to ask my simpler question first, maybe, which was, do we have a response back from the question at our last board meeting around the flexibility of that funding? Will we go into this meeting knowing the flexibility question that I asked Ms. Moore or Mr. Bloomberg?
So let me just take a stab at that. It is my understanding that the dollars that are allocated to the district to support one SRO per high school, which is the 38,000 that Mr. Smith has referenced, come in a category that does allow flexibility for it to be used for other things. That would presume that we either don't have an SRO program in the district, which is a potential outcome, or it's modified in some way. I do believe that we have access to use those funds for other things. And I think there was another follow-up question that you probably are going to ask, is the extent to which whether or not we are required to have SROs in schools. And there is not a requirement to have SROs in schools. So I think that between the two of those, it opens up options as we move forward.
Thank you.
Mr. Smith, please clarify if I missed something.
That is correct, Ms. Moore. That is correct. It comes from a category of funds that have been accessed over the years to support an SRO program, but from my understanding, there is some flexibility with regard to that categorization. And while it's not in state statute, it's been state guidance for best practice with regard to SROs in the school campus, and that's what has been the guideline currently.
Thank you, and you did answer my follow-up question, so I certainly appreciate you thinking ahead of me on that. I appreciate that. I'm glad we actually have the answer, because I do think, in the spirit of creating a committee and transparency to the community as we discuss this, is that was important for me to know going in. And you also stated, Ms. Moore, in the middle of answering that this does, in my opinion, give some clarity around how broad this committee feedback and thinking and talking could be. And we all certainly know from the petition from our students and the work that they've been doing to galvanize. I certainly think it's important that we hear their voices and are able to say that we're asking, and you all have gotten those answers for us from the last board meeting. As a step forward for me, goodwill and showing good faith that we are truly, as a board, listening and asking questions so that we can come to the table for this larger discussion with what we know now to be options. Because certainly I can tell you, as someone who attended school in North Carolina, too old to have had an SRO officer, I certainly was under the impression that we were required to have SRO officers at the high school level. So I'm going to guess that this is some clarity for a lot of people who've been curious about that. So thanks for thinking ahead of me and asking that question. I appreciate that. The other questions are probably a little bit more detailed, and you all can determine who's going to answer them, Dr. Gardner or Ms. Moore or Mr. Sutton. But I want to say, in terms of transparency and inclusion, that I will continue to bring up students. As you all know, students actually provided me the best data before we got Mr. Smith's data, that we had a group of students who we actually did get, at least in my district, a response from local law enforcement about how much money they are investing in our school resource officers. And so, I will note that our students actually got data for me that I'd never seen before. And I think it's important to acknowledge that their voices hopefully will be at the table. And I'm certainly putting my plug into Mr. Sutton, who, I've expressed a lot of interest in this committee, but certainly want to ensure that my colleagues know that I think it's also important that we talk to people and involve people at the onset, just like we did with our strategic plan, but engaging people who were impacted. And that's our students and families who have had those SRO office referrals that showed up in the chart that Mr. Smith just showed us, because who better to share with us ideas and responses than those people who are been impacted by the very system that we're talking about. And so I think it's important to note that, because all of us have gotten a lot of requests and seen the petition from our students. And that's certainly one thing I think is worth lifting up as we talk about, Mr. Sutton, next, about what this committee is going to look like. The other thing Mr. Haggerty already brought up, but I'll just, express, maybe go a step further, but I think this is similar to what Mr. Haggerty was saying, and that is being very clear with people about what we're going to do with the information collected. We have our standing committees and people give us feedback, and sometimes that feedback is folded into the outcomes that we have, and sometimes it's not. And I think that they're certainly back to the spirit of transparency and this being created as a result of the call of the community asking us to really do a deep dive into this, is that I do think we should have a conversation. Is this going to be a group of people who take into consideration what's shared with us, specifically by those people who've been harmed by this system? Or as a board, are we going to make our decision based on another set of factors? And we may not know that yet, but I definitely think for all of us, as we vote to create a committee, that we do have some real conversations and thoughts about what our expectations are. And mine is certainly that if we're going to get feedback, that we are legitimately going to include the feedback, and not leave the decision making to those who are going to be most impacted. And I say this all the time in training, in my day job of training boards, is it's really hard for people to disenfranchise themselves. And certainly this committee will include people that could potentially be disenfranchised, like our partnership with some of the law enforcement agencies. We may really walk out of this with no SROs or somewhere along that continuum. And so by including people by the mere fact who are impacted by it, I think we have to be honest about, are we truly engaging stakeholders outside of law enforcement and the school system, or are we truly going to take the feedback and are open to any options that might come out of this? And I heard Mr. Sutton's response to this, but I think that we have to keep being very clear to the public about what our intentions are and how inclusive or not we will be with the feedback, and are we really willing to include people who are most impacted by this. Then my last question, and Mr. Smith, I know that I didn't ask this question directly, so I don't know that it was asked prior to now, but that is, we've been asked multiple times, and I got a list of emails reminding me that this question has not been asked, and that is what our process is for currently placing SROs. And so if you have that, you can share that now, but I certainly think that that's going to be a necessary piece of information for this committee to start with. And that is because I don't know that as a board member, for us to be fully aware of how and who chooses which law enforcement officer particularly is placed at a school as an SRO officer, and what's that process, what's the job description. I don't have any of that information. I certainly think it'll be important for us to, one, answer that question publicly to people who've been asking, but two, that the committee certainly have that in the packet of documents that when the work starts, that'll be substantially defined and outlined for us board members.
Yes, ma'am. So that's a great question. And so what the process essentially looks like, the officers are employed by the local municipality. So they identify through their processes. And so the processes could be different at different agencies. I don't have one specifically that I can point out, but the local municipality or the sheriff's office, depending upon who is making the placement, would identify the officer that they think is a good fit to be in a school. And they go through a process of, certainly they've got to be certified at some point. There is some leeway provided per the MOU that they are certified as an SRO with the basic SRO certification, as well as CIT intervention training. So I don't know that that's answering it the way that it needs to be answered. I mean, there are some parameters in place per the MOU, but also mainly the process is done internally at the law enforcement agency. And certainly that would be an area that I think should be looked at in this next upcoming year, see if there's some things that we can do to, if the board provides that direction, then that's what we should do going forward.
And if I may interject, Ms. Johnson-Hostler, I hope you can hear me okay. I would just note that part of your question is addressed somewhat in Article 2 of the SRO MOU. Paragraphs 1, 2, and 3 talk about the qualifications of SROs, to Mr. Smith's point about training. And also in the second paragraph on assignment of SROs, there is some parameters provided there about what background SROs should have before they are promoted to or suggested for the role of SRO. And certainly we can provide more detail about the process itself, but I did want to direct your attention to one section of the MOU that would provide some detail about that.
Yeah, thank you, Maura. I have it in front of me, so I am aware it's there, and that's why I'm asking the question, because it doesn't really speak to what WCPSS does, which it sounds like we don't. We just use those qualifications and let the local law enforcement. So all that to say, Maura, yes, I see our MOU, but Mr. Smith actually answered my question, and that's local law enforcement. Each agency makes that determination. So he ultimately answered what the question was, which to your point, Mr. Smith, I certainly will be recommending that not be the only way that we have placement in our schools. I mean, I guess I am a little surprised that there's no feedback from WCPSS. I mean, qualifications are, quite frankly, easy and simple to come by because most of them are already sworn officers. So the SRO is a training program, which I think you all know. I've been a trainer for them for many years. So that doesn't really, in my opinion, speak to the process in which we have adults in the building. For me, I mean, if they're in our buildings, they're just like our teachers and everybody else we hire. And WCPSS, certainly, even with our contractors, we know that we have expectations of people in our building that go beyond their professional qualifications. And that's really the question and that I'm asking our board to be considering in this conversation is truly with SRO officers, then in my opinion, clearly WCPSS should have far more say in what's happening in our buildings as we do with any other professional, including other contractors that we use, like our custodians. We've had this conversation that the job in schools go beyond qualifications and professional certifications. So thank you, Mr. Smith, for answering my question and for doing the follow-up of what I'd certainly like to see in the future.
Can I would like to add one bit of a piece to that. Yeah. And this is certainly not the norm. There is a lack of consistency in how that selection process is in play. Some of the municipalities have reached out in the past to the school administration and talked with them, you know, as to what type of characteristics they might want to see in an officer, and or actually to meet the officer ahead of time, and maybe more than one officer to see which one might be a good fit. But that's certainly not done consistently across the board. And you know, per your point, I think it would be a good area for us to look at moving down the road.
Thank you. And that's very helpful to know that there are agencies who have been doing that. They certainly probably can provide some feedback on that, as well as those administrators who've been involved on the other side of receiving that feedback or providing that feedback to those municipalities. Thank you, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson-Hostler. I will, if you will allow me, I'll respond deeper to your question regarding the inclusiveness of the committee when we get to that point on the action agenda tonight.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Want to start wrapping this discussion up. So I've got Ms. Cash next, and Ms. Kushner, looks like you've got an additional question, and then we'll move on to our next topic. So Ms. Cash, good afternoon to you.
Hi, I just have a quick question. First of all, I absolutely agree with Dr. Martin. I think we need to go back and look at some of the history. I was on the board in the 90s when we put the SROs. It was much more than 9/11. There was a lot going on in our schools at that time. And I do want to say that I had the opportunity. I was not schooled in this area at all, very new to the board, but I did have the opportunity to work with two of the smartest community leaders I've ever been involved with, and that was Sheriff John Baker and Vice Chair Harriet Webster. And Sheriff John Baker was very impacted by what was going on in our schools. And he was, as Dr. Martin said, very interested in being a part of the solution more than anything. And so I learned a lot from him. He's probably one of the biggest community leaders that I think I've ever talked to. And what I asked, my question, that was a comment, of course, sorry. What I want to ask is that if we get into this, as we get through this, are we going to end up, or is it still among the debate or the questions, will we end up with one size fits all schools, or will there be different things that we are able to try in different schools?
Ms. Cates, I'll take a stab at that. I mean, you know, at this point, I think there's nothing that's off the table at this point, and I don't think that there's anything at this point that is predetermined. You know, so again, we want to take this time, and we've got the better part of a year to, you know, look at all options, to consider all options, and then move forward. And I think where you're going is that you're right, that there's no one size fits all, and that we have different situations, environments at different schools. We may look at safety and security at a high school in a different way that we look at it at a middle school, for example. So again, I think there are a number of options on the table. We don't want to limit our thinking. Again, I want us to be extremely open in our thinking, and that all options are on the table at this point.
Thank you.
All right. Ms. Kushner, did you have another
Yes,
comment?
Chair Sutton, thank you. I had a quick follow-up given comments by Ms. Johnson-Hostler and Dr. Martin. I wanted to ask Ms. O'Keefe and Mr. Blumberg, I know we're not required to have SROs in our schools, but are we required to have some MOU or relationship with law enforcement, just knowing that some of our most difficult examples of policing have come from responders who are not SROs, but were responding to incidents at our schools. And I would actually want us to consider having an MOU with law enforcement regardless, so that we have some agency in giving law enforcement our expectations of how our students and staff are going to be treated when they come onto a school ground. Or can we just do that in policy?
There is nothing to preclude. So obviously, let me start with, if there is a continuation of SROs, and I know everything is up for discussion, but if there is a continuation of SROs, certainly we would want an MOU that spells it out. That's just sensible. And it's, but if in the absence of an MOU, yes, there would still be a relationship between the school system and law enforcement, and there would be no prohibition on, if law enforcement were willing, to have an MOU that would govern that. In the absence of an MOU, then there would certainly be, and already is, policy in place and further policy that's under review.
Thank you. I mean, I just want to make sure that we're being proactive and having relationships with our community law enforcement that spells out our expectations of how they will be when they come onto our campuses. Thank you, Mr. Sutton. I'm cognizant of the time because I know we're waiting to get to the next item. Thank you, sir.
And I'll just add to that. I mean, I came on the board, of course, in 2009, and from what I can recall, there was a feeling that we had that law enforcement had a significant presence in our buildings, on our campuses, and that we needed an MOU to again describe that relationship or prescribe that relationship. There was not one in place, and so it was important to have that the underpinnings of that relationship spelled out. And that was when that first MOU was created, and we've had one since then. To my knowledge, as Mr. Bloomberg said, we're not required to have one. And he or Mara may speak to the Criminal Justice Partnership Agreement. I think that at this point is the only MOU, if you will, that I think is required by statute when the justice partnerships were put in place here recently. And there is work that is being done to continue to craft that MOU. Mara, Jonathan, can you speak to that? Am I correct in that?
Sure, Chair Sutton, I'm happy to speak to that. So you're correct that there is a mandate for school justice partnerships in each judicial district in the state. However, the mandate is technically for a group of stakeholders, including law enforcement, folks from the court system, school administrators and personnel to come together and talk about the twin goals of reducing referrals of technically criminal misconduct to out-of-school suspension, and also referring those criminal misconduct incidents to law enforcement for further prosecution, or results that tend to land students in some way in juvenile court. There is no technical requirement under the statute that there be an MOU or agreement signed by parties to a school justice partnership, but certainly Judge Corpening and others involved in the School Justice Partnership Initiative have come up with model documents, and it's certainly been deemed a best practice by the Administrative Office of the Courts to have some document that discusses the relationship among all of those parties. And to Ms. Kushner's point, that could certainly be one place where the relationship between law enforcement and the school system, irrespective of any SRO program or SRO MOU, is discussed.
So I do think there'll be a point in this work and this process and discussion that we'll take a deeper dive into that partnership as well, and that could be a place where much of this eventually resides in that partnership as well. So
Thank you all.
All right, Mr. Smith, Dr. Gardner, is there anything else on this topic before we move forward?
I think we are good, Chair Sutton. Thank you for this time. We appreciate the time that you've given us to discuss this, and we continue to look forward to the discussions. Mr. Smith, thank you.
You.
Okay. All right, then that moves us to our next topic on the agenda, update on the reopening plans for our schools. So Mr. Gardner, I'm sure you'll stay put, but I'll start with Superintendent Moore, turn it over to you, and then let you drive from there.
Good afternoon, all board members. We are providing you an update today, and I'll go ahead and preface this update with us to just sort of consider, as we're listening to the information and the timeline moving forward, knowing that our next board meeting is not until the first week of August, perhaps whether or not there might be space or a need for an additional session prior to then for the board as a work session again, and to provide our public greater opportunity to listen in also. That's just something to think about as we're going through the information today. So we are providing an update around a number of subjects and topics regarding the reopening. While we know at this point now that Governor Cooper has issued a statewide direction that school districts open in Plan B, meaning we cannot use Plan A. Plan C does still remain an option. At this point right now, we are focusing our efforts on what Plan B would look like, and of course the work around our virtual academy. But I would issue just a quick reminder that if there are any benefits to Plan B, and they are hard to find, one would be that it is relatively easy to pivot in either direction if needed. So we will continue to keep all of those options in mind as we provide you with an update on different things in the planning part and our work today. Thank you. Dr. Gardner.
Thank you, Board Chair Sutton, Superintendent Moore, and members of the board again for this opportunity to come back to you to provide an update around our work associated with reopening schools for the new school year. It has just been a little over a week since you as the board approved moving forward with framework for plans A, B, and C. And prior to that time, the core planning team and numerous work groups were working extremely hard to unpack all the planning considerations that had to be factored into planning within the context of health guidelines, and exploring all options possible for the different plans, particularly for Plan B. Following the board's action to approve those frameworks for the three plans, teams have been working literally day and night to develop out the details and answer the myriad of questions that surface each day as part of this work. I just want to take a moment and express my gratitude for the work that's being done to support the reopening. I appreciate the intentionality, the dedication, and the purposefulness with the team and how they're exercising their thought processes behind each decision and each component of the planning. All of this has been grounded and targeted in trying to get our students and our families, our school-based staff, and our community the answers they want and need about our reopening. Admittedly, at times I feel like there are way more questions than we have answers, which certainly adds to the uncertainties that arise every day, but you can be assured that teams across this district are committed to building out all of this with regard to the Plan B, as well as Plan A and C, and to provide the needed support to our schools and community. Today, a lot of information is going to be shared with you regarding some of the details that are beginning to be built out regarding Plan B. I appreciate the presenters who will be sharing that information with you today and the teams who have worked tirelessly with these respective areas that will be highlighted. So if you will, join me in looking at the desired outcomes by the end of this presentation. By the end of our time together for this session, an overview of the curriculum, instruction, and assessment resources that will support teachers and students in the reopening for 2020-2021 will be shared with you. You will also have received insight into the scheduling details when comparing Plan B blended instruction, Plan C fully online instruction, and our Wake County Virtual Academy. An update on our Wake County Public School Virtual Academy structure and the next steps to follow, as well as receive information about our child care programming, an element of our program that we know is a critical component to the support of Plan B blended instruction. At this time, I'm glad to invite Drew Cook, Assistant Superintendent in Academics, to join our presentation, and he will share a highlight of the work and the information that you're about to receive.
Good afternoon, Chair Sutton, Superintendent Moore, and members of the board. We do appreciate the opportunity again today to share an update on a few of the many critically important components of our district's reopening plans. Like you, our school staff, and our families, we certainly feel the increasing sense of urgency with each passing hour and day. Despite the challenges associated with constantly evolving circumstances and shifts in the guidelines and parameters that we are all working within, we fully recognize that it is critical that key decisions are made and communicated as quickly as possible, obviously so that our schools and families can plan for what is best for their students based on individual needs and/or preferences. While by no means will we be able to provide all the answers to all the questions today, we do believe that we continue to make significant progress in that regard, even since we were last with you a week and a half ago, as Dr. Gardner indicated. In our last presentation and discussion today, we'll attempt to highlight some of the areas where important decisions are being made, recommended, or even considered. To be clear, at no point in this presentation, as has been the case previously, and as will likely be the case probably for as long as the COVID-19 pandemic is significantly impacting our work, at no point will you hear us make the case that any of the decisions that we're making or recommending come close to resembling the ideal state for teaching and learning under what we would consider to be normal circumstances. That said, we do believe, however, that what we are sharing represents the very best, most feasible path forward for our students at this time based on what we know, also for our schools and our families, given the options that are currently available. And as always, we will continue working to find that delicate balance between consistency and flexibility when and where needed. So as has been the case in our work sessions recently, we do have a lot of new content and information to share and discuss this afternoon. But first, we wanted to take just a moment to orient you briefly to the organizational structure, or at least a part of it that we're working within, to give you some context on how decisions and recommendations are being made and how district-wide resources and supports are being developed and who is involved in those processes. By this point, you've heard references made several times over the last few weeks to the core reopening team, made up, of course, of 12 to 15 representatives and liaisons across multiple central services departments. The Tiered Instruction Committee is one of several working committees attached to that core group, which, like other committees and subcommittees, is made up of representatives from multiple central services departments and schools. As this committee's work has grown and evolved over the last month, so too has the development of various attached subcommittees within this area, each of which is focused on a particular aspect of reopening, with areas of focus ranging, as you can see here, from the virtual academy to summer learning to co-curricular activities and athletics, just to name a few. The reopening updates that we'll be sharing with you over the next hour or two will be coming primarily from these three areas, which will include curriculum and learning, infrastructure and schedules, and of course, the virtual academy. So this slide provides just a brief overview then of the topics that our team will be covering during this segment of the agenda. We'll start first by sharing some information on curriculum and instructional supports to schools. I'll note that since receiving the DHHS and DPI guidelines for reopening almost exactly a month ago now, we've spent a lot of our time with you sharing and discussing lots of information on plans and potential plans for scheduling and instructional delivery infrastructure across the Plan A, B, and C options. And of course, today we will continue those important discussions. During this time, though, behind the scenes, we've had a dedicated team of folks that have quietly but methodically been working around the clock to design and develop what is quickly a growing inventory of curriculum resources, instructional materials, and reference resources to support the work of our teachers and schools in meeting the needs of each of our 160,000 plus students. Part of what you'll receive an update on today will include information on curriculum, instruction, assessment, and also special education. And as much information on this work that we'll be sharing in the next few minutes, it is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the work that our teams are engaged in an effort to, as much as we can, lighten the load on our teachers in schools, while at the same time helping to ensure a baseline for what core instruction looks like for all of our students across the district, regardless of which learning environment they happen to be in. Additionally, we'll also, of course, spend some time again providing some updated information on our plans for an instructional scheduling framework and the Wake County Public School System Virtual Academy. That will include more details and parameters for Plan B, both in person and online, and also, again, Plan C and the Virtual Academy. These topics are rightfully squarely in the middle of everyone's radar right now, given the governor's announcement a few minutes ago. So we will do our very best to provide some relevant information that will be helpful in answering some of the important questions that our families and school staff have as they seek to make important decisions in their planning and preparation for the 2021 school year. So with that overview and bit of context, at this time, I'll turn it over to Michelle Tucker, Director of K-12 Mathematics and member of the Curriculum and Learning Subcommittee, who will take us into the presentation. Ms. Tucker.
Thank you. Thank you, Superintendent Moore, Board Chair Sutton, and fellow board members for giving me an opportunity to be here today to represent this vast team that Mr. Cook alluded to that is behind the scenes working vigorously to make sure that teachers have the support that they need to get the school year started. As we look at the curriculum and learning subgroup, you'll see that there are, even smaller groups that are stemming off of that to accomplish the work that has to happen ahead of us. And although there will be additional information coming forward around roles and expectations for staff across the different learning environments, as well as the professional learning that's going to be needed to support staff, today we're really going to focus in on core instruction and supplemental and intensive support and services as we talk about the support that's being provided. So as we take a look at the information that we are going to share today, we're going to focus really in on what are we developing to support teachers. We know that they are in an unprecedented time right now as they seek to meet the needs of the students across the different learning environments. And so at the district staff, we are working with one word in mind, and that is support. How do we support our teachers to make sure that we're meeting the needs of students? And so today we're going to walk through both curriculum, instruction, and assessment and some various resources that we are creating to support teachers as they support students in the classroom. Specifically, we'll take a look at the first resource on the next slide around the idea that we recognize that at least at the current moment, we have students who are going to be across 3 different learning environments, in person, blended, and the virtual academy. And our key here is that we want to make sure that students have consistent experiences around standards and learning outcomes, regardless of whether they are currently in person and sitting in the classroom with the teacher within Plan B, whether they are engaging in online activities during the 2 weeks of at home with Plan B, or whether they are exclusively online and participating in learning through the virtual academy. And pacing will be of utmost importance here as we have students who flex in and out of the building at different times through first semester, but possibly throughout the school year. And so each of the content areas are preparing a suggested pacing guide to support teachers as they have to think creatively about how they're going to function within PLTs on who might provide in-person learning, who might be providing online learning, for example, but that we are ensuring that all students are focused on the same learning outcome and standards, and to the degree possible, using the provided curriculum from the district level. So as an example, if we have students across these three environments, and for this particular week, we were to be working on addition and subtraction, we want all students focused on that learning outcome, whether they're engaging in person in Plan B, whether that's online or through the virtual academy. We also recognize with the next resource that we have the potential to have gaps that are going to exist as students transition back into the school year when we consider how we ended the 1920 school year. And so each of the content areas for math, science, social studies, and English language arts have created what we are calling vertical bridge documents, where we examine where we finished the school year at in March and recognize that there were varying degrees of engagement from March until June, and recognize that there are potential there that there could be some learning loss or gaps in students' mastery. And so we've identified what those standards are, and then we have vertically aligned them to the next grade level or course so that we are communicating with teachers who are receiving those students where there may be potential gaps. To take it a step further, we are then identifying past where those gaps are, but then taking a look into specific units and actually identifying a step further on prioritizing those standards to determine what may be additional levels of support that the teacher would benefit from as they seek to determine what students need. So I want to communicate up front that this next document that you see here is an elementary math example, and it will look different across our content areas and levels, but that some level of support will be provided consistently. But let's take a look here just so that you can understand the level of support that's being provided. If I'm a first grade teacher and I'm getting ready to teach Unit 2 on addition and subtraction, we have recognized that there are 4 standards that kindergarten students ended the last year on and may have potential for gaps there. So those 4 standards are standards that may not have the opportunity for students to have mastered as they enter first grade. And so depending on the importance of those standards and how they connect to that content, additional resources have been provided. It could be an example of formative assessment items, for example, that a teacher can use to determine a student's entry point, because we recognize that some students will have loss and others will be ready to move on to the next topic or content. There may also be the extent of creating a mini lesson where we can front load that information to students before they begin the next unit of study. We're excited about this resource and think it will be a valuable tool as teachers determine what students' needs are as we begin the 2021 school year, and also fill in some of the potential loss from the previous school year. A step further, we know that as we provide additional online instruction for the school year, we want to make sure that we are providing resources to support teachers in that area as well. And so we are creating and kind of doing the research behind the scenes about the effective components of an online lesson, and have created both teacher-facing and student-facing lesson plan templates that will be provided to teachers, where we also identify the digital tools that will help in facilitation of those different components of the lesson as well. So speaking of digital tools, we have also heard from the community, from the teachers, from the students and the parents, that sometimes digital tools can be too much and we can have too many of them and too many options. And so we're working as a district team to narrow that field of the suggested and approved digital resources that we are encouraging teachers to use, and thereby asking students and families to engage with. And we're also going to take it a step further where we can provide some models at the district level of what effective implementation of these tools would look like. So for example, if we are suggesting that teachers Jamboard as an interactive whiteboard tool, then where in our existing curriculum resources might we provide an example of that so that teachers can see how it might effectively be implemented? So now we're going to transition and talk a little bit about instruction and how we are going to support instruction, both in person and online. And what we want to stay grounded in here is that regardless of the learning environment, and whether we're in Plan B or Plan C, or whether we're completely have everyone enrolled in the virtual academy, that we stay grounded in what effective instruction looks like. So we want to make sure that we continue to include the 4 C's. We want to make sure that we are culturally responsive in the lessons that we are developing and providing. And that as teachers, we stay grounded in what research says about effective instructional practices. However, we do have to recognize that there's going to be a shift in how I might facilitate some of that instruction. So for example, if I'm in person and I have to adhere to social distancing and safety guidelines, we as a PLT are going to have to kind of think about how am I going to change my facilitation when I consider that? Or if I'm providing an online lesson to students, how am I going to have to shift facilitation, or what digital tools might I use that are going to promote those effective instructional practices in a virtual environment? The key here is that what we do at the end of the day as it relates to instruction will be the experience that students and families take away from this. So we will continue to review and support the idea of high quality instruction, regardless of the learning environment in which we're asking students to engage. Next, we also, again, coming back to the idea of providing instructional support for teachers. So we know that as school as we know it, we are shifting. And so we will have to think through a different lens when we consider various topics. And so across departments, we have come together to provide some instructional guidance for teachers, where we're giving out some information, providing additional resources and research, as well as just posing questions for the PLTs to consider and think through around topics like PLT support and how we might function, curriculum resources and learning, formative assessment and how that's going to be really important now, probably more than ever, moving forward, about how to gauge student understandings. But also considering things like how do we determine a gap in learning versus a need for intervention, how we're going to provide enrichment and scaffolding in virtual environments, for example. And then as well as behavioral health, and we know that that will be at the core of a lot of what we do. We also will continue to support the virtual instruction as well. So we talked a little bit on the next slide, we talked a little bit previously about the online lesson templates, but then taking it a step further in thinking about some of the effective instructional practices that I alluded to. How do we do that when we are doing that in an online format? So for example, here is just one of the screenshots of one of the pages of this document, and you'll see feedback and assessment. So how do we provide effective feedback and do assessment in online formats? And so we will continue to support teachers in those areas. And this is a document, one document that will actually do that for us as well. One question that we will continue to provide support in, and there will be additional information coming to teachers from various departments at Central Services, is how do we provide structures for supplemental and intensive interventions and service delivery when we think about the 3 different learning environments? So how are we going to provide interventions, for example? How will we ensure enrichment and AIG services are provided? How do we ensure that English language learners are having their needs met and students with disabilities? Karen Hamilton will be sharing more information with us today about special education services, but we'll be reaching out to support schools and teachers in these various categories as well. One area, and our last area here today that we'll discuss, is around assessments. We know that we have a lot of questions here around which assessments are going to be required from DPI, and we will continue to collaborate with them on those designated required assessments like EOGs and EOCs, for example. But we also have questions where we need to determine within our own assessment system here within the district, which assessments have the capability to be administered in person and online. And then where we might experience gaps and need additional data, how might we use historical assessment data to determine the needs of students? What we do know as it relates to assessments is that we're not asking teachers and schools to launch the school year with a plethora of assessments where we can determine all the gaps that students may or may not have. Instead, we are encouraging them to use more formative types of assessments, what we call just-in-time assessments, so that as I begin a unit of study, I can drill down into the specificity of those standards to determine where students are and where we might need to begin or enrich for particular students. And so we will continue to provide guidance here around the various assessments and the framework that we use within the system. As we pause here for questions, I do also want to reiterate that, we're crunching out resources as fast as possible, but recognize that we're kind of running out of runway here before the school year starts. And so our academics advancement team is committed to make sure that we have these resources in place for all students, even our earliest start calendars with modified and our early start high schools. And so we have a commitment to have these resources up, and we'll be communicating these resources starting on Monday with our teachers, and have already provided a video overview to them today to highlight these particular resources so that teachers feel rest assured that we have their backs and we're here to provide as much level of support as we can from the district level as they embark on the school year. So I'll pause here and invite any questions for Mr. Cook or myself.
Ms. Mahaffey, I think I saw your hand first.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Cook and Ms. Tucker. My biggest question is, how is this going to get communicated out to parents? I mean, we see this from the curricular instructional supports for schools, but a big question that parents are having is, how am I going to be able to support my child when they're in the remote learning environment for those 2 weeks that they're not in school under Plan B?
Well, I think first, Ms. Mahaffey, that a lot of what we just focused on obviously is focused on teacher supports, but I think rightfully you point out the important and critical need to make sure that our parents and families have tools and resources at their disposal to support their students, especially if they are in an extended remote learning environment, whether it's that 2 weeks of a 3-week rotation or even in a Plan C environment or virtually in the virtual academy. So I think that one advantage of Plan B is that, unlike what happened this past spring when we were fully remote, is that there will be that every 3rd week minimum opportunity where our teachers will be able to interact face-to-face and in person with students. I think there's an opportunity there to disseminate hard copy materials and workbooks and resources that are tangible objects, obviously, and materials that kids can work with and take home that was difficult to impossible to do, at least on a large scale, in the first iteration of remote learning. And then I think the other thing, I know our communications team has been working already closely with Michelle and her team in regards to how both we communicate these resources internally, because as you point out, the last thing that we want to do is to have all this work be done. And there are some incredible world-class instructional resources and support that are already in front of you right now, and more is to come. The last thing we want to do is to do all that work and have people not know that it's there. So I think in addition to what's happening at the classroom level, it's certainly going to be a priority and a focus for us at the district level, knowing that regular in-person opportunity is just not going to be there in terms of that normal chain of communication. And Ms. Tucker may have more details or context to add beyond what I just shared.
I think, as our teachers are and our parents are both very anxious to see what these materials are going to look like and to get not necessarily a sneak peek, but almost like a user guide of what their expectations will be, whether it's in the classroom or at home. And I know there's some folks who are a little concerned about, as you said, just going virtually only. I'm glad to hear that we're going to be looking to get physical materials to students. And I'm curious of, and this may be answered in the virtual academy piece. So if it is, please, I'm happy to wait. But is there going to be like an open house or a technology night before school starts so that parents and students can get familiar with the tools that they're going to be asked to use before we just throw them at the into the learning environment?
Ms. Mahaffey, in regards specifically to the virtual academy, I know that team is working right now. In fact, I believe this week is looking at an opportunity to provide a Q&A for families where some of those topics can be addressed, both I think in terms of prospective families, but also those perhaps that have already applied. So while I don't know that I've got any specific information, I think it's safe to assume that regardless of which learning environment that a student's going to be in, both at the school level and I think at the district level, we certainly recognize the need to provide those orientation opportunities to families, which we would do in normal circumstances. But I think to your point, these are not normal circumstances. And so I think it just places a premium even more so on ensuring that our families are prepared and have the resources at their disposal. So as much as a parent can be right now, they can feel comfortable and confident that they've got the resources and the supports that they need. So absolutely, I think that we can provide some assurances that there will be every effort made to make sure those resources and that information is in the hands of the public.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Mahaffey. Ms. Cash.
Thank you very much. I just, I wanted to say, first of all, I really like the presentation. I think the resources and the thought you put into this are excellent. One of the things you talked about that I thought was really important and the vertical bridge that you talked about with the support and the documents for getting students that may have not be up to where we thought they should be by the time they start the next year. So that transitioning over gaps, I'm wondering, some of the parents that have spoken to me with questions that, I mean, some questions I can't answer and most of them I can't, but a lot of them I can. There's some that have talked a lot about how can we be sure our child is ready for the next school year. And so maybe this transitional or vertical bridge that you've talked about might be something that parents can have access to.
Yeah, I don't see any reason why we wouldn't be able to make this accessible to parents. And so we'll explore, to Mr. Cook's point, we'll explore ways to make some of these resources public facing to our parents as well. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Cash. Mrs. Scott.
Sorry, thank you. I do appreciate all of this as I used my teacher lens. There's definitely a lot of information that's in here for educators. And forgive me if you mention this because we're all processing a lot of information right now. But I believe Ms. Johnson-Hostler had brought up in the last meeting about supports in place for the singletons at schools, particularly where we see in middle school and high school, we have teachers who might be the only chorus teacher or FCCLA, et cetera. And I was wondering if you could just give a little bit of an example of how these supports might look for those types of teachers.
So I'll address from a content perspective first, and then maybe Mr. Cook can talk a little bit about the singleton teachers across the district. First, it is important to note that the vast majority of these resources are being created across all content areas. And so depending on whether you are an arts teacher or a CTE teacher, there's varying levels of support that are provided. Some of those things are going to obviously look different for what a math teacher might need versus what a music teacher might need, but that we are all across content content areas collaborating. And I'm just here as one voice representing that team. And so please know that regardless of whether we have, 12,000 teachers teaching a particular content, whether there's just a handful across the district, that there is someone at the district level who is thinking about that group and preparing resources to support them as teachers transition back in. And I'll let Mr. Cook kind of address other, questions around the singletons and online learning.
Yes, and just to extend that a little bit, and Ms. Scott, I think that, the reality is, as hard as our teams are going to work and are working to provide resources and supports, that, the capacity is not unlimited. And I think especially when we're talking about singletons, we often, I think, immediately think about the high school level where there are a wide range, literally more than 100 courses, probably closer to 200 courses that are offered in terms of electives, some of them that are unique to an individual school or magnet theme. I do think a couple of things. Number one, some of the content that the teams are putting together and resources are content agnostic and probably can be utilized with some degree of effectiveness as a framework for those singleton courses and those unique electives that might exist in just a handful of schools. The other thing that I would mention, and this is something that actually predates, this challenge is something that I think predates our current scenarios. As much as our district over the last 10 years has focused on the value of the professional learning team approach to instruction and instructional planning, I think that we've got PLTs and networks that have already been established. And I think based on the feedback that we're hearing, that have been strengthened even given the circumstances that we're in via just virtual mechanisms. So we've got, it might be that we have a unique singleton elective at one high school where there's only that teacher there, but there's also 4 or 5 other teachers across the district that teach the same course. And so a lot of times those teachers work together with each other. The district does what we can do to help make those connections. But we want to do everything that we can to address the needs of all of our teachers, not just the ones that are in those core content areas.
Thank you. And I can certainly appreciate that, and it kind of leads into my second question to do with the supports that are in place. In one of the documents that's on the screen, we saw, help with screencast, or, the different tools, the different technology tools that are available to help teachers present their topics and their lessons virtually, and to record those. And I was wondering how that will go into support for our educators as they're learning to balance that, because so many of our teachers had to go from I am in person and that's it, and then boom, you have to record that, and I know that these are incredibly talented individuals. They picked it up as fast as they could, but that was a lot to take in. And I'm wondering what types of, if you could give a little bit of a better example of what types of supports will be in place to help with that, with those delivery mechanisms, so to speak, on how they're going to be offering their lessons and the supports for all these very technology heavy areas.
Absolutely. And I think one of those goals is to narrow the tools in which we're expecting teachers to engage, right? So that they can become much more well-versed, and so that we don't have 3 or 4 tools identified that essentially all do the same thing and support instruction in the same kind of manner. So that's our first goal, is to narrow that list so that then we can also have the capacity at the district level to support that particular resource. And what does that support look like? So that document that you saw, where you saw the different the items that were listed there, also include hyperlinks so that they provide an overview of what that tool is and how it might be used in an instructional way. To take it a step further, we're also exploring ways within our own content areas, so that if I'm a teacher who teaches 4th grade math, for example, that we're giving them specific examples within our already existing 4th grade math content, so that they can see how to effectively use that. So that if I'm expecting students to use virtual manipulatives, for example, that we're providing guidance to teachers within the lessons that are already created with examples of what that would look like, so that they can see essentially model lessons and how we expect both the teacher to engage, but then when students are at home and independent with these, how we expect the students to engage with them as well.
Scott, I would just add to that when you look at the rings that we shared in the previous slide, there's a whole nother team and arm of this work completely devoted to in-depth professional learning targeted to the unique needs of the circumstances that our teachers and schools are going to be asked to work in. So I do expect that in the near future, we'll be bringing an update to go into a thorough explanation in more detail on just what all the professional learning will look like to help support the work that we're sharing.
Absolutely. And they certainly go hand in hand in this this new reality. And that concludes my questions. Thank you very much, Ms. Tucker, Mr. Cook. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Scott. Dr. Martin and then Ms. Johnson-Hostler, and then we'll need to move on.
Thank you. I have 3 basic questions. First, Ms. Tucker, I'd like to ask, I heard in your descriptions a lot of discussion about, sort of the standards, the outcomes, the scaffolding. There's a concern in general in education that we particularly see at higher levels, that too much focus on these kinds of things leads to very topical oriented learning. I got this topic, this topic, this topic, and we don't see the narrative, the what ties it all together, the resources that you're pulling together. And I appreciate, we do need to pull together resources, but for example, the resources on slide 12, several of them are interactive things like Canvas discussion or Google Classroom questions kinds of things. I'm not real familiar with that puzzle. I know a bit about Discovery Education. I've seen plenty about Khan Academy. FET, I know fairly well. These are very topical resources. So, FET, for example, if you want a demo or a lavish thing on this topic, you find it, or this topic, you find it. Likewise, Khan Academy is very topic. What's missing oftentimes is the narrative that ties everything together. So, this leads to this, leads to this. So when I get to, maybe point C, if I'm struggling a little bit, how do I go back and build up the foundation of A and B that led me there? That is what the old-fashioned textbook had a tendency to do, right? It was a collated, edited collection that gave a narrative. So my question is, I haven't heard anything about the narrative aspect of education. I've heard much more about the topical aspects, gathering the topics. Can you tell us what is being done to provide that narrative issue, that narrative story, which is really important both for student learning, but it's particularly important when there's going to have to be a much greater degree of independence of learning in this new format?
If I understand your question correctly about the narrative, I think what's important to note is the resources that we shared with you today are the new resources for kind of functioning within this blended environment and the potential for the gaps that existed. I think the resources that we already have in place are that thread to kind of tie the content together, so that what you're seeing here today is that we can connect, I'm going to be very simplistic here, but addition and subtraction in first grade, and we can connect that to where it connects in second grade. But what's behind that scene are the vast majority of lessons and the in-depth connections between the different grade levels and within that grade level that are being already provided within our current curriculum resources. I think I'm understanding that question correctly, where it's not just about these broad topics, which is kind of what you have seen today, because some of the resources, as Mr. Cook alluded to, are curriculum agnostic, content agnostic, so that they can be applicable around what the research says about effective online instruction, for example. But we will be taking these tools that are broader, like Screencastify, and then embedding them within our existing curriculum so that we can explain, as a math teacher, how might you use this tool effectively, and also providing some more specific tools around mathematics in general, or music in general, or world languages in general, for example.
Well, I guess my question was more what I've been hearing from parents and students trying to, struggling with material. And this is an issue that predates COVID. It's just COVID has amplified it, of looking for those narrative components that tie things together. So I guess I've been hearing that there is a need for that, and that's where I was just looking to see, what initiatives are in place to invest in some of those resources as well. So I guess I'll go to my second question. I'd still like to hear more about, narrative resources. But my second question, really with respect to the PLT discussions, on slides 14 and 15, I think a lot of the questions that, are laid out here are good questions, are the right questions. Having worked with some PLTs, I know these are the questions that are regularly asked. So I guess the question that I hear and am most sympathetic to is, we can outline all these questions, but when are the PLTs going to be able to start functioning? I've raised this concern before, and this is maybe a Mr. Cook or Superintendent Moore question. These fundamental questions that you've outlined here for PLTs are not things that you can sort of resolve and then make plans to address sort of 2 days before classes start. So while I think many of us concur that these are good questions and questions PLTs are going to need to ask, when can we get a little bit more idea of, how are we going to get it so PLTs can start working now as opposed to 2 days before classes start?
Well, I think to your point, Dr. Martin, and as we talked about in our last discussion a week and a half ago, obviously we want to be able to produce high quality, useful materials and resources and get them in the hands of the people that need them the most as quickly as we possibly can. So I think I would respond to that by saying that as quickly as we can produce, vet, and disseminate information and get it in the hands of our teachers, I think that's our plan moving forward. I think, the reality is that obviously it is the middle of the summer for a lot of our teachers. But at the same time, with our modified calendar schools starting in less than 3 weeks, time is of the essence. So I think to your point, obviously it's a priority for us as well to get these in the hands of the folks that need them.
Well, I mean, I guess my question is not so much getting them in the hands of people that need them. I mean, I think these, like I said, I think these PLT questions would be generated by a good PLT. I've asked before, and I would still love us to continue to work toward, can we work to work with our county commissioners or somebody to, provide funding for an extra week, of PLTs so teachers, can start putting these things together, so can start doing some classroom run-throughs, because, there's work that's going to need to be done. If we just get the materials out to teachers today, many are going to start working on it anyway. And that's work being done without compensation. But I'd like to hear at least some more effort to, how are we going to make it so teachers can do this work earlier and get compensated for their work? I mean, I feel like it's just sort of, you know, I feel like it's a little bit like we know a hurricane's coming. So we're putting together the emergency preparedness plans, but we're not going to let you board up the windows until the day before the hurricane comes. It may not be a perfect analogy, but that's a sense that I hear, and I hear a need to start, you know, boarding up those windows. We know the hurricane's coming. Can we start doing some of the emergency preparedness instead of just making plans about it?
So I agree, Dr. Martin. I think we hear the same feedback, and I would actually extend that analogy and say that the hurricane is here, and it's been here since the middle of March, and our folks are working in the middle of the storm to get the materials and the resources out to the folks that need them. So I think we can certainly commit to doing everything we can to provide the time for our teachers to do the work they need to do.
Yeah, so I still think we need more than 2 days of work sessions before we start.
You mean, Dr. Martin, you mean teacher work days?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So, I mean, I'll just chime in to say that this is a perfect example of being, at this point in time anyway, required to work under some existing parameters that don't really allow us to do the things that we know may be best because of limited resources. And it is why it's important as we go through this to continue to, whether it is with our local elected officials, the commissioners who fund us, or at the state level, or and in those areas, to continue to advocate for the additional supports that are needed to actually implement the things that we say need to be implemented in the best manner. You are correct. We are asking teachers potentially to work outside of their contracted time, which we shouldn't have to do. And yet, if we're going to open, we know that based on the timeline that was established for when we are required to open school and the legislation that tells us how many required days we have to have between the last day of school and the beginning of the next year of school, we can't add any more teacher work days at the beginning of the year. And those are constraints that I think it is important that we note as we move forward in trying to make those decisions and do the work that really helps support our teachers, schools, and students.
And I appreciate that. And we'll recognize that that is part of the context of my question/comment, because I think it's just really important that we communicate what the reality on the ground is going to be like to those who have the authority to, you know, set our calendar restrictions, set our funding and whatnot. I guess my final question is, I really do sincerely appreciate the work that's being done to try to pull resources together. That is important, though I also know that many teachers have lots of resources that they have generated throughout their experience. What I hear most from teachers, well, I haven't heard any teacher asking for, we need more curriculum resources. That does not negate the fact that there is value of putting resources together. That does not negate the fact that we do need to supply resources so that we have, better consistency across the program. But what I hear most from teachers in terms of the support that they're looking for, and I didn't hear that in the presentation, is what is our support when students don't engage in these plans that we've laid out? Because these plans assume that students will engage when we have the various virtual assignments or what have you. So what supports are in place to help when engagement as written on paper doesn't turn out to be engagement in practice? I hear a lot of concern about the integrity aspects, particularly regarding assessments. So I feel like we heard a lot of detail, sort of about standards and scaffolding, but the questions that I am getting from folks are looking for details about, what are some frameworks to to build a structure of solid integrity, and accountability. And so I haven't heard those pieces, and those I would say are what I am hearing most from staff, rather than, hey, we need a lot more resources. I'm hearing a lot more, what are the supports to make sure that the action that we need to do can actually be carried out. So again, I'd be very interested in hearing, what can we do to provide a little bit more support to our teachers on those areas of engagement, disengagement, integrity, and accountability.
Yes, thank you for the question, Dr. Martin. I think, first of all, as we kind of discussed in our last session, again, obviously, a virtual environment, a remote environment brings with it unique challenges, particularly in regards to accountability. And I think we, like you, have heard loud and clear from our teachers and staff the difficulties and the challenges that they faced and experienced in the first iteration of remote learning in trying to keep students engaged. I think, first of all, one of the things that I think that we could point to that we believe will have a significant impact on raising the level of engagement and accountability is the fact that we, quite frankly, will be grading assignments. We will be abiding by, as closely as circumstances will allow, existing or pre-existing board policy around 3400. You mentioned in our last session, and it's something I think we've got to keep an eye towards, potential revisions or modifications, whether it's to board policy around grading practices or RNP. I think that raises the bar automatically. We know we've got new instruction and new learning that has to occur. And I think, quite honestly, these are challenges that our teachers tell us that they have every day in the most normal of circumstances, right? This is not unique. Engaging students in instructional content and material, right? Even with world-class curriculum resources and materials by itself, that's not enough. And so I think, these are questions that are not unique to this environment, but I think, to your point, they're probably questions that are more intense and more upfront and that we see more on the surface. And so I think absolutely we want to find ways to raise the bar for students and do it in a way that, it promotes equity and access across the board and doesn't unnecessarily penalize students. But at the same time, I think the reality is that our teachers need the resources, they need the supports, and I think, as you've referenced, they also need the time to be able to develop that narrative and develop those instructional supports in the classroom to maintain a level of engagement that I think we would hope and expect to see even in normal circumstances. So I don't think there's an easy answer to that question, and nor is there ever. But it's something that certainly we can bring more information and perhaps more detail on in a future conversation. As I mentioned in the opening, what you're seeing here today is really the tip of the iceberg, and we're happy to bring additional information on resources and supports that maybe are more specific to your question.
Well, and I appreciate that. You're absolutely right that this situation has amplified existing issues. And I'm offering that I think it would be received well by teachers to have sort of equal, focus to, lists of standards to here are, strategies for dealing with, things like engagement, integrity, and accountability. So I just offer that I think it would be really helpful to bring that level of communication at the same kind of level of detail as you've just done with standards and so on. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Point taken. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that discussion. Moving forward to special education. Karen Hamilton.
Superintendent Moore, Board Chair Sutton, and members of the board, thank you for allowing me to join you this afternoon. I want to begin where Ms. Tucker left off and remind you that 80% of students with disabilities spend almost 80% of their time in regular education classrooms. So as Ms. Tucker has worked to develop resources and develop structures, she has pulled in members of my team to make sure that those the structures and the resources represent the types of materials and the types of learning opportunities that would benefit students with disabilities. So the slides that come after this are really going to be spent on drilling down into how we will be providing specially designed instruction and special education outside or within the general content classroom where students need more learning opportunities, or certainly inside of our extended content standard classrooms. The last time that I was with you, we were hopeful that we could find a way that we could provide daily and face-to-face opportunities for pre-K students and regional program students to attend school. To that end, we surveyed parents of students who are in pre-K or will be in pre-K, and certainly parents of regional program students, and discussed with them their intent to return to school as well as their transportation needs. And as a reminder, the DPI restraints around social distancing, both in classrooms and on transportation, have remained consistent. So while it is our goal for pre-K and regional program students to attend face-to-face at this time, based on social distancing requirement in classrooms and on transportation, and the data we have to support that, students in both pre-K and regional programs are going to follow Plan B in the rotation, and they will also be mirroring the 1 week of face-to-face instruction and 2 weeks in online learning. And as we continue to gather information about students who are coming to school, how we might accommodate space-wise, how we might accommodate for transportation, if we can make any positive movement towards getting those students back into class more rapidly, we certainly will do that. When I look at support for students with IEPs, there's some considerations I'd like for you to have in your mind. The very first is the health and safety guidelines for vulnerable populations. And I know that we have about 20,000 students with disabilities, but about 2,000 to 3,000 of those students have more complex learning needs, and many of them have complex medical conditions. So we want to be really mindful as we are returning to a school setting that we are providing safe and accessible environments for those students. We've worked with Kelly Creech. We are working to secure appropriate PPE, and we're being mindful of the kind of PPE that we're securing. So for example, our deaf and hard of hearing students need to see the lips and the faces of their teachers. So we are securing clear face shields so that those teachers will be the students actually will be able to see the faces of their teachers. When we're looking to implement IEP goals, whether it's in-person instruction in Plan B or online instruction in Plan B, C, or in the virtual academy, special education, whether in general content, which Ms. Tucker's already described, or in extended content standards, need to look at how we do the same level of standard implementation in Plan B, whether it's in person, online, or in virtual academy. That, of course, is aligning with general content standards, which Ms. Tucker has already taken you through, but it is also true for extended content standards. So that curriculum will be a unique learning system, and we are busy developing pacing guides similar to how Ms. Tucker referred to for general content students. So our teachers of extended content have those same structures and the same opportunities to move within those environments with their students. When we present specially designed instruction, we also want to make sure that we are documenting specially designed instruction. The documentation allows teachers to look at how they would begin the next level of instruction with a student, and good documentation also allows for us to have rich and robust communication with parents about the progress of their student towards IEP goals. So again, we will be emphasizing not just the instruction and specially designed instruction for students with disabilities, but the documentation of those services. And I want to remind you, because it is true for our parents and it is very true for our teachers, that this federal law was developed to support students with disabilities and provide an equal playing field towards instruction in this circumstance. But it was never intended, nor was it ever conceived, that it would be implemented in a pandemic. So the kinds of challenges that are presented to our students, our teachers, and our families have not been mitigated. in terms of changing deadlines, in terms of changing the robustness of what's expected, a free, appropriate public education, and we will continue to meet that challenge as we move into services for Plan B. So with that, I think it's important to hit on what will improve or what will change from where we left school in June, when school closure started in March, and how will we move forward when school begins in August. Right now, sitting on the table, we have about 1,000 uncompleted evaluations. Those include evaluations that are simply in the referral process, and some of those evaluations were stopped mid-evaluation because we closed school. We have a team working right now, and we hope to begin within the next 2 weeks with training from Kelly Creech with appropriate PPE on beginning in-person evaluations. We also recognize that it's important that school psychologists are available to their school staff when students come back into school to support social emotional learning needs of those students. So to that end, we are going to be offering evening appointments for evaluations and weekend appointments for evaluations. And when those evaluations are completed, we will be doing the same for IEP development. And with that, we will be using some of the money provided by the state for COVID in order to pay stipends for those teachers and for those psychologists to complete those duties. That will allow psychologists to be available to schools when school reopens, but it will also allow us to move forward with these necessary requirements. When we left school in March, our original thought was we would be maintaining IEP goals. But as we moved through the school year and we realized that school closure would continue, not only did we begin to have more robust delivery around general content instruction, we were upping the ante on how students should receive special education services. When we began in August of this year, we must provide specially designed instruction for IEP goals and also for related services goals. So that, of course, will happen particularly with the kinds of things that require close proximity to students or physical assistance with an IEP goal or with a related service goal when we have in-person structures, and we are able to do that week when students are face-to-face. When we are in online learning, we will continue to support and provide instruction on IEP goals. And we will also move from where we were doing maintenance with related services to we will be providing teletherapy when students are in online services. At the end of last school year, we had developed a remote learning plan. We are upgrading that plan to make it more user-friendly for teachers, to allow us to help them build a scaffold or a transition from in-person learning to remote learning. And it will also help us when we go to gather the necessary documentation. The other thing that we will be doing is when we allot staff to schools, we allot them with some specificity around the role that they will take when they are in school. We recognize that given where we are with the need for in-person instruction and online services, that those roles may change. So we will be offering some recommendations and guidance to principals around their total staff and the requirements of their students so that they may be able to look across the special education service staff that they have in order to meet their school needs. So with the federal law also comes pretty robust monitoring and requirements. So we will continue to have IEP meetings virtually and in person where those are allowed. Right now, we are upgrading our virtual IEP meeting recommendations for teachers and for school administrators, and we will be providing those instructions to families as they enter into IEP meetings. We will also look at the assessment of students when they come into school, and a little more robustly than how Ms. Tucker was talking about using just-in-time assessment. We really want to be clearly focused on how students are managing or have progressed or have not progressed towards their IEP goals. And in about 8 weeks of instruction, we'll take a look at those assessments again, so we can determine if students have closed those learning gaps around their IEP and related service goals, or if they have not. And in that case, we would use that data to determine if there would be any necessary extended school year services or compensatory services that we would owe the students based on how they progressed in their learning during school closure. In addition, we recognize that it is very difficult for some of our parents to support some of our students when they are in online instruction. We are working with university partners to develop videos to assist parents as they access online instruction. And we, of course, will be having more personalized parent training to support those parents as they access online instruction. For many of the reasons that we have already discussed, Plan B represents some challenges for many, many students. But to that end, we are taking great pains and great and necessary steps to make sure that we are more inclusive of more families as we move into Plan B, and that we look at the challenges and we present greater learning opportunities for our students with disabilities. And I'm happy to take any questions.
In the interest of time, let me continue forward through the slide presentations, and we'll get questions at the end. So thank you for that, Ms. Hamilton. And Brian Pittman.
Yes, sir. Chair Sutton, members of the board, it's my pleasure to be with you this afternoon. As we get started discussing structures, I want to be intentional about setting context for what will be shared. First, you are seeing details that reflect where we are at the present moment. It's a snapshot in time and not a final destination, because we are trying to balance the need to continuously get more feedback while also knowing that schools and families need us to make and communicate decisions so that they can move forward and make decisions of their own. So while adjustments are possible, this presentation does seek to narrow to some specifics that will assist those stakeholders in making decisions. Our other goal here is to provide a baseline for programs across schools. Ultimately, we have to be sure that we accomplish two critical things when we look at structures for reopening. Number one, structures in plans B, C, and in the virtual academy must provide essentially equal options so that one structure is not seen as the one that is preferred instructionally, easier, or having more access to rigorous coursework. For these reasons, structures must, to the degree feasible, be similar across all of the different learning environments. Second, the specific numbers and details that we share with you provide a baseline, not an absolute outcome. The balance between those two things is the balance between the desire to have consistency across the district and between schools, and trusting school leaders to make decisions along with their teachers that are in the best interests of students and learning. So again, trying to balance those things, but also creating a baseline consistent across schools. It is important that you keep these two things, equal access, equal programmatically across environments, and establishing common baselines across schools in mind as you look at each of these upcoming slides, as it will, I hope, provide perspective and a vision for taking steps forward. On this and on the next slide, we'll begin to go over key considerations that will apply to each level, elementary, middle, and high. First, it is important to note that instruction is expected to happen across all learning environments, Monday through Friday on all school days. Second, students will receive approximately 5 to 6 hours of instruction and/or instructional activities each day, regardless of the learning environment that they have chosen. As you consider this, the 5 to 6 hours includes and excludes certain things. When in person, it excludes lunch, recess, and time for transitions. When looking at remote or virtual environments, this does include both live instruction, where students and the teacher are able to interact at the same time, as well as non-live instruction, both of which are very important. This 5 to 6 hours also includes time reading text, web quests, practicing skills, engaging in virtual labs, practicing the tuba, and many other things. It is key that we explicitly say that both live and the counterpart, the non-live instruction, are equally important to the plan. Live instruction, which is a component, not the component, that makes each learning environment successful. Before we get to the numbers towards the bottom of the slide, I want to take a moment to define this live instruction that I keep mentioning. Here, what we're talking about is instruction that provides an avenue for two-way communication and real-time interaction between teacher and student. This could be the teacher checking in with a small group, providing instruction for 10 to 15 minutes to introduce a concept, classroom guidance with the school counselor, students and the teacher engaging in a Flipgrid activity at the same time. Live instruction could also include an hour of lecture, something that few would listen to, whether whether online or in person, for a full hour. These examples seek not only to define more clearly the idea of live instruction, but also to illustrate that it's important to remember that it can be both good and bad depending on how it is done. The key issue is to provide instructional practices that are effective and engaging, and often not only accomplish the standards, but also hit the narrative that Dr. Martin mentioned earlier. This is a capacity that we have been building for years in the district, and that capacity is one of our greatest resources when we consider structures that we build. The task here is to build structures that build on our strengths and not seek to recreate the world in which we're trying to work. All that being said, we do want to address today the topic of live instruction because it's a component that our community and our teachers are asking about frequently. Also, again, we need to be sure that we set a baseline for what students are receiving across the district. Now, to get to the specifics that you see on the slide. In Plan A or in person in Plan B, live instruction happens throughout the day. In Plan B with remote instruction, we are committing to 5 hours of live instruction per week as a minimum baseline that happens concurrently with asynchronous instruction. Again, it is a baseline, and that is important to remember. I need to note that the number here is not, as Mr. Cook mentioned earlier, set because it is what we think is ideal instructionally. I think we all recognize that that would be being able to engage in Plan A. It is what we think we can successfully implement and commit to based on available personnel, resources, and other things across all schools. With Plan C and the Virtual Academy, we are committing to at least 2.5 hours of live instruction per day. A key detail here is that we're seeking to provide approximately 30 hours overall of live instruction for the student over the course of a 3-week rotation period. Notice that this is approximately 30 hours of live instruction for the student, not necessarily live instruction for each individual course. Again, I want to be explicit here and call out a few things. First, this is an intentional effort to ensure that what is being delivered across all environments is ultimately about the same thing. It's important that the environment does not determine the outcome or what a student receives. That needs to be the same across the different environments. Second, we need to acknowledge that many are asking why we cannot just live stream instruction from the classroom. There are a number of reasons why this is not feasible as a district-wide plan. Technologically, the Wi-Fi infrastructure within our buildings will not hold up and function the way that we may want it to if we're streaming even a small portion of the teachers within the building at one time. It would be glitchy, have poor technical quality, and in general be frustrating for the end user, which does not help us to get to an engaged student. Second, it is instructionally not the best idea. As was described to me recently, we envisioned this to be more of reality TV when we think about streaming the classroom. In reality, it is more like watching a bank security camera, where if the teacher is doing what we recognize as being highly effective in engaging with students who are present, then you're fairly consistently going to be watching a blank screen or the wall in the front of the room where the teacher won't be because they're moving around and being engaging. And so again, we just wanted to call out that question that we know has been asked by many teachers and parents alike. With regard to the instructional program, we need to acknowledge a few other things. One is that the amount of time on a screen or device will depend on the age of the student and the courses that they are taking. We have to encourage students to take meaningful breaks regardless of their learning environment. We also need to acknowledge that there is great instruction that can happen in a remote environment and in the virtual academy that does not involve any device. Next, communication about the daily bell schedule and the times of live instruction will be communicated to families at the school level. There is not a one-size-fits-all model for the entire district that honors the uniqueness of our schools in terms of programmatic needs, magnet themes, etc. And just to be clear, schools will not be in a position at this time to go ahead and communicate that. They will need time to develop that collaboratively as a staff. And finally, as Ms. Tucker discussed earlier, we are using similar curriculum, pacing, and resources across the different learning environments. Last on this slide, we note that in order to make this feasible for the teacher workload, we need to build explicit structures to create time and space for teachers to do the work, to engage in remote instruction, and most critically, to engage in meaningful PLT work to ensure that instruction and goals and planning are consistent across the PLT. And we need to do this to some degree within the existing school day. To be transparent, we don't have a final answer at this point as to how to do that. We do invite stakeholders, especially our principals and teachers, to brainstorm with us about how that can effectively happen. But we did feel it was critical to call out that need within this presentation, even though we don't have a final decision for you today of how we would do that. As we round out providing structure details, we need to address some level-specific information to explicitly answer questions that are being asked frequently. Again, it's our goal here to set a baseline to create consistency across the district. At the elementary level, instructional structures will shift based on what is age appropriate for the student. For example, we must recognize that the screen time that is appropriate for a K-1 student is much different than that of a fifth grader. Second, literacy and mathematics instruction will be something that students receive daily, as has been the case in their classrooms in the past. Finally, specials such as music and art will still happen at the elementary level. We will look at additional recommendations for how we minimize movement in the building, while also working to support safety needs of our staff in implementing these specials. At the middle school level, we are committed to students still engaging in their electives and to have access to high school for credit courses at the middle school level, regardless of their learning environment. At the high school level, it's important to call out that opportunities to access honors and AP courses will not be altered based on the implementation of Plan B. No high school within our district should be cutting courses simply to comply with the fact that we are in Plan B. Also, we want to be sure that we say specifically that we will continue to offer our arts, CTE, and other specialized electives, and are working to provide supports to those teachers and how we would do that. I hope these details begin to pave a road. This is certainly not the end of the flow of details around structure, but it does establish a foundation for parents and schools so that decisions can be more informed. Most important, I remind you of our critical goals here: consistency across environments and setting a common baseline across schools. Before I pause for questions and feedback, I want to acknowledge up front that there are some more granular details that we are not going to have answers to yet. We are still collecting feedback and working through those, and it is as is often the case, a single answer creates several more questions. Also, I want to acknowledge that we know that the only thing worse than waiting for information is receiving information that later changes, and we want to show respect for our community enough to provide as accurate information as we can when we can. Finally, on a personal note, I do want to thank our community of parents, teachers, and principals and others for all of the feedback that they are providing. As a principal, I learned clearly that each communication I received was an act of love. Regardless of what the feedback is or how it is delivered or the emotion attached to it, it is always important to recognize that it comes from a place of love for our students, our staff, and their well-being both now and in the future. I encourage that voice to keep coming as it is a critical tool to shape our path. That said, I'm happy to receive questions and feedback at this time.
So again, thank you, Mr. Pittman. Again, we need to press forward because we still have two very healthy topics to move through. So board members kind of note your questions. And when we get to our question and answer session, I'm going to ask you to try to be mindful of the time. So next up is the Virtual Academy, Dr. Thompson and Cedric Williams.
And Mr. Sutton, just real quick, I thought I'd take just a moment since you've yet to hear from Dr. Thompson and Mr. Williams in this role. Going back to the kind of organizational structure that we shared with you at the beginning of the presentation, just in the last couple of weeks, kind of as a spinoff of the infrastructure and schedule subcommittee that Mr. Pittman and his team have been leading, we have created an entire team devoted entirely to the Virtual Academy planning, design, and implementation. And so I wanted to kind of just quickly introduce the board to Dr. Thompson and also to Mr. Williams, who will have taken this on over the last couple of weeks. They've got a cross-departmental team, again, with school representatives as well. They've already hit the ground running in terms of beginning to work through a lot of the details that we know that our community and our board need. We know our parents need information to feel like they're making informed decisions. So at this time, I'm happy to introduce and very appreciative of both Dr. Thompson and Mr. Williams, but they will take us through the presentation and share more information on the Virtual Academy.
Thank you, Drew. Good afternoon, Board Chair Sutton, board members, and Superintendent Moore. As Drew said, Cedric Williams and I will be sharing more specific information with you about the WCPSS Virtual Academy. I'd like to start by highlighting the core goals that have been established for this fully online option for students. First of all, the WCPSS Virtual Academy will provide access to an additional instructional option for students where health concerns exist with returning to the school building. Additionally, it will provide a personalized, flexible learning environment that provides students with rigorous, standards-aligned learning opportunities in an online setting. And lastly, it will provide students with a certified teacher or teachers. As you all know, the application window for the Virtual Academy is open now and will remain open until July 20th. At this time, I will share with you that we have approximately 26,000 applications for the Virtual Academy. I would also like to call attention to the opportunity that families not currently enrolled in the Wake County Public School System have to enroll in the Virtual Academy. Those families can find information on the Office of Student Assignment website regarding enrollment procedures. And also, once the application window closes, it's important to know that schools will be sending a confirmation letter to families so they are informed that their student has been enrolled in the program. Regarding enrollment, few key things to emphasize here. First of all, for enrollment in the virtual academy, the students remain assigned to their current school. Their current school assignment does not change with enrollment in the virtual academy program. Next, we are asking that families commit to a full semester of learning in this program with the recommendation of a one-year commitment. And lastly, students who participate in the virtual academy will be permitted to participate in co-curricular and extracurricular activities, including athletics, should that time come. And they may do that with their current school while enrolled in the academy. Regarding the calendar for the virtual academy program, we gathered input from our calendar committee regarding which calendar the virtual academy program should follow. And as you know, this calendar committee includes principals from each of our district's calendars. And there was unanimous agreement that the virtual academy needed to align with each school's calendar. And as such, we've made the decision to do that, to align the traditional calendar schools with the virtual academy program being traditional calendar. Likewise, the year-round calendar schools, if students are in year-round, they would be on the single track 4 calendar if they are in the virtual academy program. And for modified calendar schools, the virtual academy program would be on the modified calendar. So the calendars would match. We recognize there are a number of questions on the topic of scheduling and the instructional day. I'll try to address some of those questions through the content in this next section. To the degree possible, students will be assigned teachers from their current school. However, there may be some instances where students could be assigned to teachers from other schools in a region to form virtual academy classes. Next, as Mr. Pittman mentioned earlier, students and families should expect instruction in the virtual academy to happen Monday through Friday. And it's our intent to offer all K-8 core courses and all high school courses required for graduation in the virtual academy program. But because course offerings for the virtual academy will be built based on the course selections of the students who enroll in the academy, it's difficult prior to the application window closing to identify more specific courses that will be offered. It is our intent to make every effort to ensure there is a baseline menu of core and elective course offerings across the multiple content areas. Next, as Mr. Pittman shared earlier, students in the virtual academy will receive approximately 5 to 6 hours of instruction and/or instructional activities per day, regardless of learning environment. And specifically in the virtual academy, at least 2.5 hours of live instruction per day. And this time may increase beyond that baseline based on teacher planning. We also want to emphasize that students will experience an intentional effort on the part of their school staff to make meaningful connections and to create a true classroom community. And lastly, instruction in the virtual academy program will be tightly aligned with instruction for students in Plan B, as detailed in earlier slides by Ms. Tucker and Mr. Pittman. To be more explicit, curriculum and instruction will be aligned to the same content standards as in-person and blended instruction environments. In addition to that, grading structures will be consistent in both environments. And class and course options will include standards-aligned instructional content and SEL support across all grade levels. In addition, supports from AIG, ESL, intervention, 504 plans will all be provided by the student's current school. And supports for students with IEPs will be provided by the current school and determined by the student's IEP goals. At this time, I will turn the presentation over to Mr. Williams, who will provide additional content.
Thank you, Dr. Thompson. So I have the awesome task of talking to you a bit about the communication plan thus far with the Wake County Public School System Virtual Academy. First thing I would like to say is since creating the web page, we've had over 117,000 views with about 78 or 79,000 targeted visits, meaning viewers actually looked around in the site. And as Ashley just talked about, a number of students who have decided to sign up for our virtual academy lets me know that we are getting a lot of traffic on our website. So what we've asked principals to do is to make sure that they direct families to the website so that families are aware of the website and the FAQs that are listed there as well. One thing I do want to say is we've assembled a marketing team and our members are working on a plan to target our population of students that may still be unaware of the virtual academy. In just a moment, I'm going to talk to you about one of the things that we're going to do this Thursday. I just mentioned the FAQs. The FAQs are on the Virtual Academy website, and we're updating those whenever we get questions from you as school board members or some of our principals or family members, especially as it seems to be a topic or a question that is coming from multiple people. I just mentioned one of the things that we are going to launch into this Thursday, the Wake County Public School System Virtual Academy Open House. There will be a virtual open house featuring information about the new Wake County Public Schools Virtual Academy. It will take place this Thursday, July 16th, from 5:30 p.m. to 6:30 p.m. Wake County Public School System officials who are designing the Virtual Academy will be on hand to address questions that we have collected from families and teachers over the last several weeks. So board members, while we will obviously not be able to answer all questions, we will address those that have been the most common among our community. So please stay tuned for that. Once again, that will be this Thursday from 5:30 to 6:30. We're sending information out to parents probably right now as I speak so that they are aware of this opportunity to learn more. Last thing I want to mention as far as the communication piece is concerned, we will continue to use our school messenger and social media to keep families informed about the Wake County Public School System Virtual Academy. As I look at our next slide, I just want to talk to you a bit about the technology piece. Through the Virtual Academy application form, parents can indicate whether their students need devices and access, internet access. We'll be working to help meet those needs as we receive notifications. I do realize that a lot of students have already received their device from last semester. So if you have that, great. But if it's a situation, especially as we have new students starting, and as you are filling out the Virtual Academy registration, please notate that and we will make sure that we reach out to you. The next thing I want to mention also is virtual courses provided through a common online learning management system. So we will be similar in nature to what students will have in Plan B or the remote learning piece, where we're going to make sure that we're using a common online learning management system for that. I do want to say one other thing as far as devices. I didn't mention this earlier, but we've let principals know that we are putting a plan together at the district level to make sure that we can get devices in the hands of parents and students who may not have them. So parents, don't look to your child's principal right now and demand a device. That way, we're going to make sure that we have a plan set up to get those in the hands of those who need them. So please stay tuned for that. Going to our next slide, it talks about staffing a bit. Our first bulleted item here states that individuals teaching in the Virtual Academy will be staff members based at the school where they are employed. So it's not like a separate standalone school. This is a program within each school. So our goal is to make sure the teachers within the school are the ones who are teaching the kids who are in virtual academy. Teachers will serve students assigned to them from their school or within their school's region. So we may run into situations where if a school only has a few students that need to be served, we may have to go to a neighboring school to help support those few students at that particular grade level. Third bullet item here, principals will assign teachers to the virtual academy. I'll get to that shortly, but just understand, board members, that because we feel as if the principals at each particular school know their teachers best, we're asking them to make sure they are assigning the teachers, but we will give them some guidance in doing so. My last item here, district staff will offer school principals guidance on key qualities to consider when assigning teachers to the program. That's our next slide, where we are offering guidance to principals in doing so. And I'll come to that in just a moment. But first, I want to talk to you about this school contact. We will have individuals at each school, and we're calling these individuals the school contact, where we are recommending to every principal to have this be the assistant principal to serve as the school contact. We just want to have somebody at the school that kind of knows the ins and outs of the virtual academy, knows which students are part of the virtual academy, able to respond to questions as regarding virtual academy that the parents may ask. Also, but to support virtual academy teachers accessing resources to support curriculum and instruction. So we've already started the discussion and conversation with principals on who this person should be and how to go about selecting this individual. Moving to our next slide. I'll ask that you look at our next steps here. We have 4 different next steps I want to mention. District staff will communicate with schools regarding registration numbers. As mentioned earlier, different departments, let's just say our technology department, may end up having to correspond and have communication with our schools about the devices needed for each student that is signed up for the virtual academy. Our second item, district staff will work with schools to support staffing and scheduling for the virtual academy classes. We've called on our area superintendents to play a huge role with this. We want to make sure that our principals also have support in identifying the teachers that will probably be most beneficial in the virtual academy experience. I'm going to stay here for just a moment and talk to you about a few items that we've talked to principals about, or will talk to principals about, as they identify in their particular teachers. First thing we've said to them is teacher responses on the preference form or health considerations and approved accommodations. Those are things that probably first and foremost principals should consider and think about as they are assigning teachers to the virtual academy. Also, experience and work in the spring 2020 with remote learning. So what was that experience like for some of the teachers during the spring semester? Was it a situation that they seemed to enjoy and be able to really do a great job with the students and parents and communicating and making sure that it was easy access for students and parents at home? Also, strengths in building and maintaining strong positive relationships within a virtual learning setting. And that goes back to, like I just said, in the spring 2020, was it a situation that the teacher was able to build a relationship, a great rapport with students virtually? Because that's not an easy task. And the last thing I'll say is what type of prior coursework and training does the teacher have in regards to virtual learning? It's always good if you have some kind of background or some type of knowledge to pull from in being a part of the virtual learning experience. So those are some of the things that we're asking principals to think about as they are selecting teachers to be a part of the virtual academy experience. We will continue to advertise to make sure all regions within Wake County are aware of the virtual academy. And a last next step here is the district will work with schools to create virtual classrooms that truly reflect the Wake County Public School System core beliefs. With that said, I think our next slide is the question and answer period.
So thank you, Mr. Williams and Dr. Thompson. At this point, given the time, it is 5:40, we're 10 minutes into what should be the start of our board meeting. So I'm going to pause here. Again, board members, hold on to your questions. I'd like for us to move to our board meeting. The last section of partnering for childcare, we'll place this on the information section of our agenda. And then we'll finish the slide presentation and take questions during the information portion of our agenda. So that way we don't keep our public waiting for our public meeting. So I will, again, ask us to pause here. We will adjourn the work session at this point. Ask everyone to move to our board meeting and we'll start as soon as we can, roughly about 5:45, and we'll continue with this discussion and then take question and answers during the information session. So thank you all for joining us for our work session. That will conclude the work session and we'll now move to our board meeting.
Mr. Sutton, real quick question.
Yes.
Will we need a motion or anything to change the agenda to add these when we get there?
No, I don't believe so. Since it'll be an information item, I don't believe so.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks for the question, though.